We're going to finish with one final example to tie all of this together. We're going to write an employee class to represent employees at a company. So you could think about a class like this being used perhaps inside of a human resources HR system that's tracking information about employees. Now you could think of a lot of things that represent an employee, a lot of different characteristics. We're just going to use name, ID, and phone number. Of course, you could think about salary, hire date, social security number, address, lots of different things, but we're just going to start simple with name, ID, and phone number. So I'm going to create a class called employee, and I'm going to start with my basic 4 building blocks. So the first of those is my instance data variables. So I want name, ID, and phone number, and I'm going to just store them all as strings. It's possible you could think about an ID being a number, but if I want to have characters in my string like A457, then I'd want to have characters in my ID, then I'd want to represent it with a string instead of with an integer. And of course I want to make my instance data variables private. So that's my first block. Next up is my constructor. So public employee. Oop, and I misspelled employee. Put an extra E in there. Let's just fix that really quickly. There we go. Okay. So for my constructor, I need to take in all of that information in order to set up an employee object. So I'm going to take in the employee's name, I'm going to take in the employee's ID, and I'm going to take in the employee's phone number. And I'm going to use all of that information to initialize my instance data variables. So name gets the name, ID gets the ID, and phone gets the phone. So this is my constructor. This is how the user sets up objects, creates objects of type employee. So that's my instance data variables and my constructor. Next up is my getters and setters. So my setters are pretty straightforward. They just return each value. So public string get name returns the name. Public string get ID returns the ID. And public string get phone returns the phone. No parameters for any of my getters. Again, getters are pretty straightforward. Next up is my setters. So I first have to make sure that I want to provide a public setter for each one of these pieces of information. So do I want to allow an outside class to change that information? If I do, then I provide a setter for it. So public void set name, the new name. So I take in the new value and I say name gets the new name. Now I could potentially check to make sure that this string you're sending me isn't an empty string, but that's sometimes you'll see that in string setters, sometimes you won't. I'm just going to leave this as is. And then I'll have public void set ID, string the new ID. Now this would be one that I'd have to really think about whether I wanted to include it or not. Perhaps I don't want someone to be able to change an ID of an employee once they're created. If that was the case, I just would leave off this method. I just wouldn't include it, and then there'd be no way for outside classes to modify that variable. And then a setter for phone. You could think about some verification or validity checks you might want to do on the phone, making sure it's in the proper formatting, but that's a little beyond where we're going to go right now. So there's my first 3 components, my instance data variables, my constructors, my getters and setters. Now I'm going to write my toString, which again returns a text representation of my object. So I get to decide what this is. I'm just going to say that my string representation is just going to be the employee's name plus maybe their ID in parentheses. You could think about including also their phone number, or if you had other information that described the employee, you might include that. You might just decide your toString just is going to be the employee's name or just their ID. So again, you get to decide what components make up the text representation of your object. And that's our first, that's our basic building blocks, our instance data variables, constructor, getters, setters, and toString. And now I can just think about adding on whatever class-specific methods make sense for this class. So I'm just going to write a couple methods that we might think about, and I'm just going to write simple print lines in front of them, or inside of them rather, to just give you an example of methods we might write. So for example, we might write a pay method that described how an employee was paid. I'm just again going to put some print lines inside of here, just so we have some methods that are specific to this class. And then perhaps a review method. So all of our employees go through some sort of review, conducting review of name. And then perhaps some sort of method to process the benefits of an employee. So these are, again, just simple print line outputs, but it gives you an idea of the kinds of methods, that you might include in a class that describes an employee. Okay. So that's my employee class. So now I'm going to create a class to create some employee objects and invoke some methods on those objects. I'm going to call this my company, and this is going to have a main method because I'm actually going to run this class, run this program. Again, the employee class is just my blueprint. It just sketches out what an employee object will look like, doesn't actually create anything. But over in my company class, I can create a couple employee objects. So I can say, hey, E1 gets a new employee, and maybe this is, Wally, my worker, W157, and maybe the phone number I'm going to give my employees is just kind of the company main line. You can just call the switchboard and ask for a Wally worker. So that's one object of type employee called E1, and then I use the new operator and the call to the constructor, sending in all the information. These are the actual parameters that I need to create that object. And now we can create a second object. Sam Slacker, not my hardest worker. And again, Sam just has the company line. Okay, so this creates two different employee objects. Each object has its own version of the instance data variable. So E1 has a name, ID, and phone. E2 has a name, ID, and phone. What's stored in the position of E1 is a memory location to somewhere else in memory where all this information about this employee object lives. What's stored in E2 is a memory location to somewhere else in memory where all this information about the employee object lives. So now that I've got my objects, I can invoke some methods. So this is invoking the pay method on object E1. So E1's the invoking object. Pay is the method that I'm invoking. I can do things like I can print out the object. Remember that behind the scenes, this will invoke the print line, the toString method. Now let's say I decided I need to give Sam Slacker a separate phone line. Maybe I think that will improve his productivity. So I could perhaps say a2.setPhone 555 call Sam. Okay, and then to make sure that updated, I can say e2.getPhone. Okay. And then let's run an employee review. Let's see if getting Sam that phone actually improved any performance there. So here's just the idea of invoking some methods on my objects to test everything out, make sure it's all working. And here you can see my pay method printed out paying employee Wally worker. I printed out E2, which was Sam Slacker with the ID in parentheses. I printed out the new phone, and then the review was conducting review of Sam Slacker. So hopefully this example helps kind of bring everything together. Again, the ideas of designing your classes and then having another class. This is often called a client class, which uses that class design to create objects, invoke methods on those objects, and hopefully this helps kind of tie everything together with one last example. We'll be reusing this example in a future series when we talk about inheritance. So we'll be reusing that then, but for now we have a good start with just some good strong class design.